is no climate justice without racial justice. There is no climate justice without gender justice.
We need to look at redlining in order to understand why we need climate justice. The rejection of home loans and insurance by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s was part of a government campaign to segregate people of color. To achieve this, they developed a residential security mapping system that rated housing based on desirability, with the lowest tier being identified as dangerous. The neighborhoods on the bottom tier were painted red, giving rise to the term redlining. These tiers determined where capital investment would be made in the most hazardous and undesirable neighborhoods, or where many people of color would be pushed into. Hazardous waste sites surrounded these redlined communities, and many were moved out of their homes if more toxic waste disposal infrastructure needed to be built. A racial justice study found that in communities surrounding 2 or more commercial waste sites, 38% were racial minorities and 24% were in communities with only one site. This contrasts with the average amount of racial minorities in areas without any waste sites, which is 12%.
That same study, which was conducted by the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice in 1987, marked a watershed for the environmental justice movement. It also found that half of all Asian Pacific Islanders and American Indians lived in communities with uncontrolled toxic waste sites. Approximately 3 out of 5 Black Americans live in a community with uncontrolled waste sites, and African Americans were found to be 75% more likely than white people to live near commercial facilities that produce noise, odor, traffic, or emissions that directly affect the population. In other words, America is purposefully poisoning people of color. Recent studies have collected overwhelming data that this issue has not been resolved. Corporate irresponsibility is another major contributor. Many companies declare bankruptcy in order to avoid the costs of cleanup and rehabilitation of the land. Racial minorities are not thought of as a concern by these big businesses because they're seen as weak and inferior, and because they're typically underpaid and overworked, they often don't have the ability to fight back due to their economic stressors. Above all, capitalist corporations value the finances gained from the suffering of these victims.
Let's look at the science behind climate change and how it disproportionately affects low-income communities by looking at the urban heat island effect. In low-income communities, they are more likely to have man-made spaces with tons of asphalt and concrete. During the daytime, these man-made surfaces would turn solar radiation into heat, and when the evening starts to cool down the air, the heat is then re-released back into the atmosphere. Another problem with the lack of green spaces is that it leaves little biodiversity, meaning an increase in rats and mosquitoes that are notorious for spreading diseases. The 85-mile region between New Orleans and Baton Rouge is referred to as Cancer Alley due to a high population being diagnosed with cancer and other environmental-related diseases. The Cancer Alley is dominated by African American communities with 136 petrochemical factories and 6 refineries near it. Dr. Beverly Wright's research revealed how fossil fuels harm people of color by polluting the environment and talks about the boomerang impact. The boomerang impact is the increased occurrence of extreme weather patterns from global warming, including hurricanes. As we see a wider socioeconomic gap, we start to see how these natural disasters affect people of color because of economic inequalities, and economic inequalities in America are intertwined with race. By looking at 3 factors of environmental injustice and racism, such as race, class, and environment, we understand the fatality of climate change and who it actually affects.
Luckily, the environmental justice movement has gained popularity over the years. The movement for climate and racial justice continues, and there are now a wide variety of ways that we as individuals can contribute and make a difference.